Stranger at Home, Chapter 1, page 16. When we passed the Hudson's Bay Company store, my mother asked my father to stop and buy me some of the outsiders' food. He laughed for a good while and told her that I was still in Nouvelle-Louis. When I got hungry enough, I would eat. My mother and I looked at each other. Neither of us was sure. My spirits lifted when we made it to our canvas tent, which was set up on a wooden frame near a small lake a short way past the village. My father's dogs greeted me with yelps and barks. We had no animals at the school, and I had missed them so much. I reached out to pet one of the 9 sled dogs, but it nearly took my hand off. "Wait until you wear our scent again," my father said, drawing back the canvas door. I followed him into the darkness and stood blinking as my eyes adjusted. Then I smiled a slow smile. It was exactly as I remembered it, just as it had been on Banks Island. The cook stove stood near the center, the table close to it, and my mother and father's bed was against the south wall. I leaned forward, ready to race for the spot under their bed where I had always slept, but stopped myself. It probably belonged to one of my siblings now. I looked to my mother, and she nodded with a smile. It was still mine. I dove under the big bed and onto the quilt that covered my small mattress. As I rolled to face the far side, I saw a small stack of my half-sister, Rosie's books, which she must have left behind after her last visit. I was so excited to have something to read, but I was sorry I had missed seeing her. I wanted to tell her how bad I felt for not believing her when she warned me how awful the school was. So many things had happened already, it was barely past lunch. I really needed to talk to someone like my big sister who understood what I was going through. But I would have to settle for her books. I just wanted to curl up in my bed with them and drift off to sleep, while the warm red glow of my father's pipe illuminated the dark tent. My father peeked his head under the bed to see what I thought of the books. I hugged one to my chest. It was such a gift. My father had a kettle in his hand, and as he rose to put it on the stove, I crawled out from my sleeping place, still hugging the book. My mother was at the foot of their bed, searching through the large wooden chest that held her things. At last, she pulled out one of her old parkas, a rich burgundy one embroidered with cream flowers. A detailed Delta braid ran through the hem. Lace decorated the shoulders and the wrists, and a stunning burst of wolf fur stood up around the hood. I remembered how beautiful she had looked in it long ago when we had come to a wedding here in Tuck. It was my favorite of her parkas. She looked at it a moment, then set it in my lap. "For me?" I asked, pressing the fur to my face. She smiled and nodded, understanding my gesture, if not my words. My sisters came through the door of the tent with my brother just as I pulled it out over my head. I was now as big as my mother, and I felt very grown up in her parka as I strutted around the tent for all my family to see. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. I could tell she was envious, but I felt no pity. My mother's parka could not take away 2 years of shivering in my thin, ill-fitting uniform and canvas bloomers, nor could it make me forget the shame of being forced by a cruel nun to wear the school's only pair of bright red stockings. Being teased about how fat my legs looked in them had been the most humiliating experience of my life. But the fur of the Parker's hood against my face helped me to feel like I was no longer that powerless girl. I needed my mother's parka in a way my sisters could never understand. We drank tea, and I did my best to answer my family's questions, my father translating everything at first. After a short time, a few of our words came back to me, but I was not able to respond to many of her questions on my own. It was frustrating. After only 2 years away, I could barely speak my own language. I had tried to preserve my memory of it, but what I had retained was like a clump of dry dirt that turned to dust in my hand. I wanted to laugh and giggle with my sisters, to tell them stories and teach them what I had learned, but the words were too few. I could speak to them only with a phrase or two, and my heart felt smiles. Mamaktuk, I said, pointing to my tea. Tastes good. Everyone smiled, and my mother's smile was the widest of them all. My sisters pulled out 2 dolls that my father had made for them and begged me to play. I shook my head because I had no doll of my own. At the school, I had made a doll from scraps of fabric one of the sisters had given to me, but before I left, I gave it to a smaller girl who was not going home. My sisters pawed at me for attention. I had no words to tell them why I did not want to play their game. Mabel picked up a caribou hide ball, and Elizabeth pulled me outside by the arm. We tossed the ball and ran until I forgot how homesick I was for Banks Island and how much I missed my friends from the school. It was so good to be back with my family. By supper time, I was very hungry, but still could not eat. My mother stared at the table and cried. She worried that I would starve to death, but my father said something to her, then turned to me and spoke in English. You'll eat when you're ready, won't you? I was as unsure as my mother. The pain in my stomach was growing, and I wondered when my body would know that it was ready. Before bed that night, the family gathered around me as I read aloud from a book that a kind nun had given to me. Mabel was the same age I had been when I fell in love with the stories my big sister Rosie would read to me. Elizabeth was the same age I had been when my love for those stories and my desire to read them led me to the outsider school. I wished Rosie were there to watch our siblings, listening as intently as I had once had, even though they could not understand the words. My sister's eyes grew wide in the dim light as they strained to comprehend what I was telling them. My brother Ernest sat on my lap and looked at the pictures. My father translated for me, and they all marveled that I could now decipher the outsider's words. Even my mother was impressed. I could tell by the way she kept looking up from her sewing. Just as I was getting to a good part, my father looked up from his seat at the table and told us it was time to go to bed. My mother tucked my sisters into the bed and they shared, and my brother got under the covers of my mother and father's bed. I crawled under the warm blankets beneath where my parents slept and gazed out at the glow of embers from my father's pipe. A heavy ocean-like sleep settled over me, and I drifted off to the dream time. It wasn't Banks Island, but it was home. Even though I missed my friends at the school, nothing would ever make me go back. I belonged here, in this tent with my family. I wasn't able to hide away on a distant island, but maybe, just maybe, the dark walls would ward off the outsider's spell. End of chapter 1.